This week has been really interesting from a macro perspective with the CPI report coming out, but it's also been really interesting for SoFi. A couple of their competitors reported earnings, which we'll compare and contrast. Galileo launched a couple of new products. And finally, a US judge out in Texas declared the student loan relief program from the Biden administration being unlawful, which has the potential to hugely disrupt SoFi's student loan business in 2023 if this has further implications onto the actual moratorium. In this video, we're going to cover all three of these pieces of news, so let's jump right into it. Before we dive into the video, I'd love to pause and just remind everybody that if you are watching these videos and you do enjoy them, please share them out. If you do enjoy the SoFi news, commentary, and analysis, subscribe to this channel for more of that content. And there's a lot of stuff that I really don't talk about on a macro level with regards to CPI, with regards to what's going on with FTX, and a whole bunch of other companies that I don't really make videos about. I share all of that in the free Discord, which is linked in the description below. I pretty much respond in real time to whatever's going on and share my thoughts around that, thoughts that I don't really share on Twitter or YouTube. So definitely join that if you're interested. Now, speaking of, this week has primarily been driven by the macro. I mean, FTX was one thing which drove a lot of the crypto markets, but also the CPI news that came out on Thursday came out better than expected. And of course, this drove one of the biggest rallies in the stock market since 2020, with the Nasdaq up in a big way. I think it was up like 6% today. With CPI coming in better than expected, this is obviously positive because CPI has been a leading indicator for what the Fed will do in subsequent meetings. And we know that the Fed has an upcoming meeting on December 13th where they're expected to raise interest rates again by another 50 basis points. We'll see what this data actually does to that decision, if it changes it or if it reinforces it. The Fed has already said that they want to become a little bit more neutral with regards to the economy, still raise rates, but not as aggressively as they've been doing previously. However, a 2023 recession is pretty much confirmed. It's consensus. Everybody you ask will pretty much be in agreement that in 2023 there is an incredibly high likelihood of a recession. I think it's pretty much unavoidable at this point. But there is a discrepancy here between what the stock market does and what the economy does because of a time variance between those two factors. The stock market is forward-looking and as a result is in advance of the economy. So even though we might be going into a recession in 2023, the first half of 2023 could signify a turnaround for the stock market. And so this is why I'm talking about this, especially because SoFi on aggregate has been moving up and down in wild moves purely as a result of the macro environment and less so as a result of that individual business. Now, it's also interesting because a lot of competitors also reported their earnings report over the past week because it puts SoFi's earnings into perspective. If all small caps or mid cap fintech companies are doing very well, then SoFi's earnings can be chalked up to, macro strength. However, if everybody else is struggling and SoFi is actually thriving, then that is SoFi specifically beating out all of their peers in a very tough macro environment. Now, in this chart that you see, I've put all of the small cap to mid cap fintech companies that SoFi is very often compared to. And I've mentioned in the past that this is not going to be a pure apples to apples comparison since the value offerings for these businesses are vastly different. A lot of these companies focus on lower income individuals and that affects their numbers accordingly. And keep in mind that SoFi, their members on average earn about $170,000 annually with a 750 credit score. So they're among the top earners and the lowest risk of default credit-worthy customers that you can have. I don't think you could say the same thing for Affirm or for Robinhood, for example. So that's just a disclaimer that I'll say, before I even jump into this list. And immediately as we go into this list, we can see that Upstart missed expectations for EPS and revenue by pretty big margins. Affirm missed on the bottom line, which they've been doing for several quarters now. Robinhood actually beat numbers, but I think that some of their metrics were weaker than expected, and overall it was not a super impressive quarter for Robinhood despite the beats. But still, it's better to beat on those expectations as opposed to missing them, especially because Robinhood has a history of missing regularly, especially on the bottom line. Out of all of the competitors, I would say Lending Club was by far the best earnings. And I have nothing really horrible to say about Lending Club except for the fact that they lowered their guidance, whereas SoFi raised their guidance. So in addition to beating on the top and the bottom line, this guidance discrepancy is really what puts SoFi above and beyond, especially compared to all of these other companies on this list. And raising guidance in this market is very difficult to do. I don't think any of the other businesses actually did so. So for SoFi to report the quarter that they did is spectacular, especially when you put it into the context of what their actual competitors did. And obviously it goes without saying after 30 videos on SoFi that my opinion is that the company is best in class for what they do, and much of this comes from their ability to be a one-stop shop, but also their ability to continuously execute on that vision. And speaking of this execution, let's move now into the second topic focused around new Galileo product offerings or new features around Galileo as a whole. Now, this snippet was posted on Reddit outlining that the Galileo team has added reference material and guides in their developer documentation for new B2B products that are in the preliminary stages as of this recording and are anticipated to be released very soon. The first product is fleet cards. Now, here we're looking at Galileo's technical documentation, and on this page, they explain that this is for companies that maintain fleet vehicles to track and control expenses for those vehicles, such as the fuel and the repairs for the fleet vehicles. Now, let's read through this. MasterCard offers specialized fleet card bank identification numbers that provide enhanced authorization clearing and reporting capabilities. Fleet card issuers can receive data such as the driver ID or the vehicle ID, both at the time of authorization and at the settlement for that transaction. Galileo parses the fleet data that MasterCard provides and then passes it on to you, i.e. the client, so that you could perform detailed expense analysis. So at a high level, let's basically say that I'm a driver and I drive the last mile delivery vehicle for FedEx. If I stop and refuel that vehicle, I'm paying with my card. That transaction is passed over to Galileo that analyzes all of the specifics, and it's passed over to headquarters to analyze that expense management tracking. Now, in the actual documentation itself, they split this up into two types of different cards. Number one is driver issued cards, and number two is vehicle issued cards. So this is self-explanatory. In the first case, they would issue fleet cards to individual drivers to either buy fuel or buy maintenance and segment their purchases based on their driver profile of which merchants and which items are applicable. Different spending controls can be imposed so that some drivers can spend more than others depending on what their responsibilities are in the organization, and detailed reporting on how funds are spent are provided. Now, all of this contributes to customers of Galileo being able to manage their costs and plan for future expansion. Now, where the first type focuses on the driver, the second type of fleet card focuses specifically on the vehicle. So building clients for fuel and maintenance based on the vehicle mileage and really tracks the vehicle life cycle and expenses regardless of who the driver is. So in this use case, for example, let's say you have a company vehicle and that vehicle is used by multiple drivers. It would be more efficient to track that vehicle specifically than to track the drivers that are using it. So just scrolling down onto this page, we can see some of the level of detail provided at settlement from MasterCard to Galileo, all the way from the brand name of the oil company to purchase time, to specific service type, to odometer reading, vehicle number, driver ID, and many, many other criteria that is passed forward in terms of that data segmentation. So this is absolutely fantastic because you can all of a sudden imagine a world where all of these businesses that currently have a fleet for last mile delivery or for order management, all of a sudden can unlock value and insights with Galileo through using this feature of fleet cards. And by doing so, they can optimize and also justify cost savings measures for expense management as a way that's more accurate than what they were doing before than the traditional legacy methods. And the best part of this is that with Galileo's APIs already in place, it's all plug and play for these businesses. So basically, this is an additional value proposition that they can just leverage Galileo for. Moving on to the second product, direct deposit switch. The list in Galileo documentation and the goal of this function is to increase customer engagement and spend, highlighting that accounts with direct deposit have about 10 times the lifetime value than accounts without direct deposit. However, the conventional methods of setting up your direct deposit is pretty cumbersome, it's prone to mistakes, and this is because the account holder has to manually provide all the routing, the account numbers to their employer or their payroll provider, either by filling out some form, giving out a void check, or updating information on an online portal. And since there's no checks back and forth, you only realize you've made a mistake when your first paycheck doesn't really come in several weeks later in many cases. If something was to go wrong, it's going to take a long time to fix that issue, and this is where Galileo comes in with a fast and an easy solution to set up your direct deposit. So very quickly, how it works from a customer experience perspective is you just select your employer or your payroll provider from a list drop down, you log in using your credentials, and you can specify how much of your paycheck you actually want to deposit. And then you just submit the request, and that's it. And one thing that I found really interesting was that this allows you to allocate a specific amount, since Galileo highlighted that you can create accounts for purposes such as vacation or regular deposits or an education fund. And so you can have different accounts, and you can automatically, from your payroll provider level, when setting up direct deposit, allocate what percentage of that paycheck you want to split to those different accounts. They go on to say in their documentation that the switch provides around a 50% increase on direct deposit adoption over conventional methods. Obviously, it provides user satisfaction because it's easy to do, and more importantly, about 70% of all customers can use direct deposit switch because Galileo is already integrated with all the federal agencies. They're integrated with most of the top employers and payroll companies, all state unemployment agencies, as well as gig worker platforms such as Fiverr and Upwork. Finally, the third product is the dispute API around integrating a dispute process into the mobile app or website. And as the name suggests, this is used to initiate and resolve disputes that may come up from clients with a conversational API method. So without getting super technical, as a lot of this documentation is meant for development teams and engineers coding these solutions, at a high level, this helps you create new cases for customer support and customer issue resolution. It allows you to present those cases, and Galileo highlights some examples of what dispute claims might look like. So for example, being charged incorrectly, being dissatisfied with the service received, having never received the merchandise or product, being charged more than once. All of these are frequent disputes that come up. All of these reasons have their own type and their own field in the actual code base itself. And this is passed forward to the system through Galileo to get a questionnaire on that dispute with a specific unique case ID to work through that questionnaire and solve that dispute. So all in all this does is it helps make the process of handling disputes and case resolution so much faster because it helps you automate a lot of the process, especially with regards to a lot of the common issues found in disputes. And ultimately, it's just another example of Galileo, how it helps businesses. And the reason why I mention these three products is because I know that it's very hard sometimes to translate what Galileo does on a real case-by-case basis because Galileo's offering is B2B and it's very, very technical for the average viewer of this video or the average investor in SoFi stock. So I hope through these examples listed, through these new features that Galileo is launching, that you can better understand how Galileo serves as that one-stop shop, helping other businesses enable faster responses and save money and do it all in an optimized way that gives those businesses insights onto the technology platform side. Finally, the last piece of news that I want to cover in this video is with regards to the student loan moratorium, following up on an article that we discussed in a video about 2 weeks ago around the pushback that the Biden administration was getting on canceling student loans. Reuters earlier today, as I'm recording this Thursday night, reported that a federal judge in Texas had struck down Biden's debt relief plan, claiming it was unlawful and must be vacated. The judge in question, Mark Pittman, called the program an unconstitutional exercise of Congress's legislative power. Now, if you'll remember from our previous video, this debt relief plan had already been temporarily blocked by the 8th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, which we mentioned more in depth how that came to be in our last video. If you haven't checked it out yet, definitely check it out. The U.S. Justice Department promptly moved to appeal that ruling. The White House press secretary said in a statement that obviously the administration strongly disagrees with this decision. About 26 million Americans have applied for student loan forgiveness, and the Department of Education has already approved requests from 16 million from these 26. The press secretary said that their goal is to move very quickly after they win in the appeals court. However, in his 26-page ruling, the Texas judge, Pittman, said that it was irrelevant if Biden's plan was good public policy because the program was one of the largest exercises of legislative power without congressional authority in the history of the United States. Now, those are very, very strong words, but basically at a high level, he highlights that the HEROES Act, which the administration relied on for this relief, did not specifically authorize $400 billion in student loan forgiveness program. And so basically he's saying, hey, you did it without having approval from Congress, therefore it should be revoked. So now that we understand what's happening, this really leaves us with one question of what comes next in this story. And I've been following this news piece for a couple of weeks now as it's been developing. And as we mentioned in our previous video, this should not affect SoFi very, very directly because SoFi is more concerned with the moratorium ending and less concerned with the actual student loan relief plan because a lot of SoFi's borrowers are very high credit score, very high earners, and so a very, very, very small percentage of them, if any, would be eligible for this loan forgiveness as it has a cap on the salary. What comes next is the Biden administration is going to continue to fight this to the Supreme Court, appeals courts. It's going to be a back and forth battle between these parties until a final decision is made whether the student loan forgiveness goes forward or whether it's halted altogether. However, the reason I continuously bring this up is the worst case scenario for SoFi that can happen is if the moratorium is extended until all of these appeals are settled. Since both of these pieces of news, the forgiveness and the moratorium, were announced in conjunction with each other, there is a possibility that until all of this is resolved, both of those pieces will be temporarily halted. And so that's essentially the case. Right now, I do think that's a very small likelihood. I think it's very likely that the moratorium ending is going to happen just as we said. In January in 2023, SoFi should be fine. I also think that it'd be super detrimental and it would deteriorate people's trust in Biden if both of these pieces were halted because, I mean, student loans, for example, was halted for like 8 times, and this was the last extension until the end of the year before it would start again in 2023. Now, this is my biggest fear at the moment. With regards to this news, I think if the student loan freezes, this would be massively, massively negative for SoFi in 2023. However, I think mostly the topic of conversation right now from the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, from a lot of Republicans pushing back on this, and from the Texas judge in general, all of these members have been more focused on the student loan forgiveness plan, and nobody's really talking about the moratorium extension or the moratorium pause until all of this is relieved. There is a possibility that that can happen though, and I think that right now we should get more clarity over the coming weeks on what specifically will happen in the appeals back and forth. If there is a Supreme Court ruling or a judge ruling or an appeals court ruling that basically says, hey, let's put a pause on everything Biden said that day and let's reassess, then SoFi might be in a bad spot for 2023. I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's just going to focus on the forgiveness for right now, but that's essentially the bear case. Anyways, that concludes this video. As always, to stay up to date with SoFi news, commentary, and analysis, subscribe to the channel for more. If you enjoyed this video, please share it out with other SoFi investors and other people who you think might enjoy it as well. For right now, this is the Fundamentals of Investing podcast. Thank you so much for listening.